Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Sean Spears. I'm Director of Green Alliance. Welcome to this post-budget briefing and a general stock take on where we think the government is going after what has in effect been, if you take out the period of mourning following the death of the Queen, about 7 days where we've seen almost the wholly new administration appointed and a raft of announcements. Yesterday, I should highlight 2 or 3 things that were said in the run-up to the budget. There was an interesting piece in the Daily Telegraph by Alistair Heath, the editor of the Sunday Telegraph, who said of Liz Truss, her plans appear almost too good to be true and are in many cases exactly what free market critics have been calling for from the far fringes of the wilderness for so many years. It certainly feels as though we're in 2016 all over again, and that the past 6 years have been a bad dream. Truss wants a Thatcherite Brexit, the only kind that would actually work. She will weaponize tax and regulation to suck capital and jobs out of Europe. So Alistair Heath is certainly somebody who wanted a very ungreen Brexit, what Green UK Coalition called a low standards UK, undercutting international standards on environment, animal protection, food safety, and so on. So he is very pleased. The Wildlife Trust said, instead of a plan for nature's recovery on land and on sea, the UK government is pursuing a dangerous agenda of deregulation that puts the very laws protecting wildlife at risk. And the RSPB, another fairly conservative body, said yesterday, the RSPB is deeply concerned that the government is about to start a full-on attack on the laws that protect nature. And today, in response to the budget, they said, alongside the potential powers in the retained EU law bill, which is one of the topics we'll be discussing later, the government has effectively launched a full-on attack on the laws that protect nature. So is it as bad as all that, or are there silver linings, or even perhaps it's all very good? We've got a panel today of experts from Green Alliance, Sam Alvis, Head of Economy, Sarah Williams, Head of Green UK, Chris Venables, Head of Politics, and Hotfoot from the Dentist, Ros Bulleid, Director of Research. I'm afraid Helena Bennett, who was on the billing as Head of Climate Policy, is unwell. But we're going to hear from all of them, and then I hope people will put questions in the Q&A box. By all means, chat among yourself in the chat box, but we won't be monitoring that, but put questions in the Q&A box, and then my colleague Sophie O'Connell will field the most popular questions and put them to the panel. We are certainly not in Green Alliance saying we're experts on everything. We work with a lot of NGOs who will be right into the detail on all of this, and a number of coalitions. We're working with the Wildlife and Countryside Link on the retained EU law bill, and Wildlife and Countryside Link will certainly be looking closely at nature protections. I know the Better Planning Coalition, led by CPRE, will be interested in the investment zones and so on. So there's a lot of debate to be had, but we thought it'd be useful to get this sort of quick take on the budget and the first, as I said, effectively the first 7 days of the new government. And do please tweet using the hashtag GA debate as well. So if we can start now, I don't know, can people put their cameras on? I'm finding it hard to know who I'm talking to. Sam, you're up first. Just your instant reaction to the budget today from Kwasi Kwarteng. What should we make of it?
Thanks, Sean. So I think, to first off, as a warning, there's going to be an awful lot of quantifiers and adjectives about this budget, because far from being the mini budget or the fiscal event that we were promised, it is absolutely massive. And it is the third of a series of massive interventions that we've seen this week, starting with the energy support for households on Wednesday, and then the energy support for businesses yesterday, and then the wider fiscal intervention from the government today. But so we have to put the size of the interventions today in context. The reason why there's been such a scale of intervention is because the economy is staring down the barrel of some serious challenges. Inflation, although slightly lower thanks to the intervention over energy prices, is still going to be running at double digits for quite some time. The Bank of England, in response to this, have put up interest rates at one of the fastest growth rates we have seen, and they're likely to top well over 5% in the next couple of years. The pound, even before it dropped even further today, is seriously weak against the dollar and the euro, and there is a serious threat of recession coming down the line. So they started this week, and colleagues will go into this more with this massive intervention over energy. And that is because energy is the biggest driver of the economic challenges we're facing, and predominantly the ever rising cost of gas. So there was support for households, support for businesses, and this new loan scheme as well to protect energy companies from going under. What we didn't get anything on energy demand, and I'm sure we'll go into that quite a lot today. The one caveat to this, so one of the reasons it was called a fiscal event today is that there was no publication alongside of impact assessments, policy costings, independent assessment of the Office of Budget Responsibility, the sort of things that normally accompany a budget. We don't really know how much this energy intervention is going to cost. We have a rough estimate of 30-60 billion over the next 6 months. That's a lot of money that is going to be on Her Majesty Treasury's books, His Majesty Treasury's books even. And hopefully that will inspire them to some action to try and limit that cost over the next couple of years, particularly when it comes to energy efficiency. But the big story of today is the desire of this government to return to growth, and putting front and centre the target to hit 2.5% of growth over the next couple of years. Good to see, everyone wants to see growth. The difficulty for the government, 2.5% is a very specific target, it's very easily measured, so we will be able to see whether their efforts come off. So the question is then, how do they expect to get to 2.5%? And for that, we get our plan for growth. And that is our 6th plan for growth, or iterations of the above, in the last 12 years. And it's a big divergence from a government that both the Chancellor and his Prime Minister served in just a few months ago. In terms of the green agenda, there is lots in there that could be used to deliver growth, and green growth in particular. But there are big challenges, and I'll go into sort of 3 areas: tax, the investment zones that Kwasi Kwarteng talked about, and infrastructure in particular. But first of all, to note, on top of the huge energy, the amount of money we're spending on energy, this is a very costly plan. We are talking an average of 29 billion spent over the next 5 years, or 29 billion forgone by tax cuts and other measures. What that does is really constrain government's ability to borrow down the line and really boost growth in other ways. I mean, in summary, what we can say is there are things in here to help with net zero, although not necessarily nature, but it is going to make the job of doing so a lot harder by the scale of borrowing that they are doing now. So to start with tax cuts, a massive handout, and explicitly acknowledged, in fact, by Kwasi Kwarteng and his Prime Minister, Liz Truss, that this is going to be better for those who are already best off in society, with the idea that that will stimulate growth across the board, which will therefore benefit everyone. We will see. They've cancelled the rise in national insurance. They've cancelled the rise in corporations tax. They are getting rid of the top band of income tax, and they are lowering stamp duty. Now, not a lot of those have much interaction with green, but again, that use of money that is not targeted to specific objectives like reaching net zero, like driving productivity growth, has not necessarily aligned this spend with the need the economy has. On to investment zones. So these are specific areas where deregulation or certain industries will be concentrated. You will benefit from even lower tax rates, from faster planning regulations, etc. Now, investment zones traditionally displace activity. They don't necessarily grow it or add additional economic activity. But there is an opportunity alongside new technologies, particularly in place-based industries like green steel, or aligning with the research and innovation catapults, that could see these investment zones being used to accelerate net zero nature objectives. I'm sure Ros will go on to talk about the green power pool, but you could see that being applied, for example, in these areas. And then finally, infrastructure. So it's clear this government wants to get building again. It's always encouraging to hear a Conservative government desire to return to building and make the delivery of nationally important infrastructure a priority. And for a lot of that is vital to net zero in nature. We know we need new railways. We know we need energy infrastructure. We know we need adaptations to the grid. There are some things in there that we don't need, whether that's new road schemes or improvements to existing road schemes, though with the caveat some of those are to improve active travel. As well as expanding North Sea oil and gas. That's really not going to help us in the middle of a gas crisis. So we are going to get a new planning bill, which will help do some of this stuff. But for now, we just have a list of about 100 priority projects the government really wants to accelerate. And we are going to see hopefully some EV infrastructure in there, and rapid charging, some hydrogen, CCUS, nuclear, offshore wind, which will all be beneficial. And the rabbit that was not the rabbit, as far as Kwasi was concerned, was onshore wind. The planning regulations for onshore wind is going to be brought back in line with other major infrastructure. Which is fantastic to see, fastest energy we can get on the ground. So, big changes, very expensive changes. This was a political budget intended to create a series of dividing lines with the Labour Party and as well to potentially speak to her backbenchers. The economics yet to be proven, I think.
Great, thanks, Sam. So lots of stuff on tax, investment zones and building, which could have desirable spin-offs from an environmental point of view. But is there any sense in the accompanying document, there wasn't in Kwasi Kwarteng's speech, is there any sense in the accompanying literature that this is being viewed through a green lens at all, or is the green stuff that we might get out of it, as it were, accidental alongside a lot of much less green stuff?
So I think we are in a bit of status quo ante here, in that net zero is seen as something that benefits from the government boosting growth rather than seen as the way to generate growth. For me, that's a massive miscalculation. Even the Treasury in the net zero review last year said that actually investing in green infrastructure will give you 2.5 times the returns of investing in sort of traditional brown or fossil fuel infrastructure. So the fact they're not seeing that as the vehicle to return to growth is disappointing. But there is lots in there and lots to come as well. We have the review of net zero and its relationship to growth, Chris Skidmore. So hopefully that will point the direction of this quite high level plan and how it can be targeted better. But yeah, I think, again, we have all of those tools to be used, but their targeting towards green and their desire to put green front and centre is not really where this government's at the moment.
Great, thanks, Sam. We'll come back to you later. And just a reminder to people to put questions in the Q&A function on your screens. Ros, if I can turn to you now, could you just say something about the what we should make of the energy relief schemes that have been announced recently?
So we've now got two schemes in place, or the details of two schemes set out by the government. One that came a few weeks ago for domestic customers, and now one for business customers. They're slightly different in the way they work, and they run for different lengths of time. So the consumer one's for 2 years, but the business one is just for 6 months in the initially. And the business one is also a bit different in terms of a total cap on the amount of support it will offer. As Sam has said, and we all know, there's a huge potential cost to taxpayers in that, and that is a big risk for the economy. We could have expected more today on how to address that. There was a slight increase in energy efficiency funding, so 1 billion over 3 years added to the eco scheme, which was welcome, and that will obviously be some help, but it's not at the scale that that was hoped for. They could have. There are basically some limits as to how fast you probably can scale up energy efficiency action because of the supply chain. But the assumption was you could have done an extra billion a year, and the aim should really be, we think, to be achieving about 10 billion investment in energy efficiency a year by the end of the decade. That would match what Germany does. So, I mean, hopefully this will be followed by more, this initial announcement, and that will begin to perhaps bring down some of the risks associated and the costs associated with these support packages. There was nothing new at all along those lines for business energy use, and that's a frustration as well, because we know there will be untapped potential. In fact, even just there's just even limited data on energy use in businesses that kind of help us target that. So the government did point to its Industrial Energy Transformation Fund in its advice to customers, to businesses around the relief scheme, but that's due to finish shortly, and it's not got a sort of successor in place. So schemes like that we kind of urgently need to see replicated or extended as well. The other way you can also address this as well, and government is doing, and this cost of the package, on at least on the electricity side, is by trying to capture more of the value of renewables, which are new renewables now are 9 times cheaper than gas generation. So there is a sort of intention, and this is repeated today, to try and move renewables, capture some of the older renewables and value of the older renewables, and use them to bring down the cost of electricity for everybody. So that's, I mean, that's a double-edged sword. It depends on what rate you manage to lock them in for and how long, but it could be a promising mechanism. Sam mentioned the green power pool, which is also something we've talked about as Green Alliance, and it's an idea that's kind of originally came out of UCL, and that would be another way of capturing the value of renewables by offering that particularly to vulnerable consumers, maybe the most fuel poor, but you could also trial it with particularly, this is where we suggested previously, that sort of very electricity intensive new technologies that would transform industry. So that's another place you could try that mechanism. And we know that, well, we think that the energy bill has been paused for a while to allow it to be aligned with this growth plan. And we know government is concerned about this issue around marginal pricing, the fact that the price in the market is set by gas, which artificially or unnecessarily inflates the price. So mechanisms like green power pool are a way of kind of separating out the prices. It'd be really interesting to see whether we do get some opportunities on that front. It will take a little bit of time, but something like that could be in place potentially, or some of those mechanisms, by the time the business support scheme ends in 6 months or is due to kind of progress to the next stage. And also, actually, just to add that I suppose businesses were given a bit of a threat that only some of them and only the most vulnerable will be allowed to continue on support schemes past 6 months. So there is a sort of a bit of a threat there, but there's a stick, but possibly no carrot. So it'll be interesting to see how they respond to that. And I think certainly there are some concerns in industry as well that there might be kind of times when they're forced to turn off as well if there isn't more activity on this front. So yeah, there's a fair amount going on, and there's some sort of initial signs that some of this could, some opportunities to kind of capture some benefits for green technologies out of all of this, but a lot remains to be seen, I think.
Thanks, Ros. Could you just explain green power pool, and also if you were a betting woman, would you bet on it coming in 6 months' time?
So a green power pool is it's never an easy thing to explain. So essentially, it's the idea that you capture the cheaper value of the renewables by offering it directly to consumers through a sort of package, essentially like a packaged power purchase agreement with government as an intermediary. That has several advantages. It offers stability to industries and lower or vulnerable consumers, because it would be offered in a fixed term. It might also stimulate new renewables development to feed into that as well, because it might help unlock kind of new renewables, and there's still a cap on the amount of contracts for difference that onshore renewables can capture or access. So you could link it in that way, and it could maybe start to lead to new renewables. But the idea is that you offer actually a portion of the market, the price of renewables generation when the renewables are at high enough capacity, and obviously they have to purchase the rest of the time, therefore buffering them from the impact that gas has on the price. Sorry, I didn't give you my betting statistic.
What are the odds?
It certainly feels like, there seems to be a lot of interest from government coming in now, the new leadership, in this idea that you might try and separate out the cost of renewables from the wider cost of electricity. So I think I'm pretty certain that they will do something to capture the valuable renewables, but whether they, I think might be 50-50 that they look at this as a sensible idea and maybe have a trial in place. I might be being optimistic.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Ros. So, Sarah, if I could turn to you now, an announcement earlier this week on the retained EU law bill and a sunset clause for all retained EU laws. Could you just explain what's being proposed, and also how greatly we should welcome it?
Yes, indeed. So I think we can safely say that the government's deregulation agenda is now clear, although we wait to see some of the details. So some of the things that are announced today, the plans for investment zones with relaxed planning rules and flagging wider reforms, that detail is yet to come. But yes, what we do have is the retained EU law revocation and reform bill. So this sounds very dry and technical, but is going to put us on an incredibly unmanageable and unnecessary timetable to replace or lose crucial laws covering a huge array of issues. So public health, consumer protections, workers' rights, as well as the environment. it's all the laws we deliberately brought over during Brexit to avoid gaps and legal uncertainty appear on our statute books. They're covering things like food safety, water quality, chemicals. I mean, it's stuff that people really tend to like and provides important certainty for business, but we are where we are. So DEFRA actually has the largest amount of laws to get through of any government department. And indeed, if DEFRA was to fulfill the aim of scrapping all of its laws by December 2023, when the sunset clause comes in, officials would only be able to focus on each law for a day, as long as they also worked weekends and public holidays. So this is at the same time as the DEFRA is facing substantial cuts to its workforce. So it's just a really incredibly difficult and challenging process. So yes, at the end of it, though, these laws will need to be replaced or restated, or they will automatically expire at the end of next year. And ministers have given themselves vast powers in the bill to just get on with that. Changes will need to be made via secondary legislation, and that means just a yes/no vote. So Parliament won't be able to make any amendments when those bits of law are laid. So there's basically just going to be very little opportunity for parliamentary or public scrutiny throughout this process as well. Now, plenty of parliamentarians are going to be very concerned about this sort of bypassing of Parliament, not very sort of take back control really, particularly in the Lords. So we're expecting a sort of feisty campaign on this bill, but fundamentally it's an incredible amount of risk and hassle when we should be getting on to improve environmental protections rather than ripping them up.
Thanks, Sarah. And I wonder if this is going to be of concern to the European Union in given the commitments to a level playing field in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement.
Yes, so obviously the Trade and Cooperation Agreement doesn't stop things changing after Brexit. There's lots of flexibility included, but what it does include is a commitment from each side not to weaken or reduce its environmental protections, but in a manner which affects trade and investment between them. So that's the kicker. So any lowering that has happened on either side has to have a direct impact on trade and investment before the other side can raise concerns. And that's a test that's really difficult to prove, particularly in certain areas like in nature. It's a lot easier to show how sort of chemical businesses are helped by a reducing of environmental protection. So we'll have to see, and it's obviously up to see whether the EU actually wants to take action on this. I mean, it feels more likely at this point than perhaps previously, given the wider politics between the two sides. But it just remains to be seen as to whether it sort of sets any barrier to lowering standards. But it's certainly something the government should be considering whilst it develops policy, this obligation that it's signed up to in the EU trade deal.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So, Chris, if I can sort of turn to you for the helicopter view, and I don't want to give you sort of too leading a question about trying to inject some cheer here, but I think generally the NGOs have got pretty gloomy about this, but we still have a government committed to net zero. There are some good announcements sort of sneaked out on onshore wind, on energy efficiency. There are some ministers in post who've been very strong supporters of net zero and perhaps to a lesser extent the nature agenda over the years. How would you sort of summarize what we should make of this first week of political activity of the new administration?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I don't know exactly who said it, but as is often said, politics is the art of the possible. So I will try and sum up what I think, or at least pose a few questions that I think we should all, those of us interested and active on the environmental agenda, be thinking about in response to this morning's mini budget. And I echo what everyone said, in particular where Sam started, that it was so much more than a budget. The IFS have said it's the biggest tax cutting event since 1972. It wasn't just Kwasi standing at the dispatch box, it was Kwasi standing at the dispatch box with the Prime Minister behind him. A video out on the Number 10 and Treasury feed at the same time, with them both sitting around the table talking about what this moment means for their agenda. So I suppose echoing what lots of people have said, in response, this was an ideological and political pitch for what this government and what this cabinet represents.
And I suppose that does reflect, just thinking back to a couple of weeks ago, the decision that Truss made over that weekend before she stepped into number 10 to fill the cabinet with people who are very much on the right of the Conservative Party. So we're seeing that play out. You'll have seen potentially briefed into many of the lobby that many Conservatives have said they feel like Conservatives again. And I suppose that kind of reflects the paradox, I think, of this announcement. On the one hand, we've had, as Sam pointed out, a Conservative Party getting back into its groove, tax cuts, and playing to its base. I guess I'm thinking about the things that Sam mentioned on income tax, on cutting the threshold for higher earners, and yet at the same time seeming to very explicitly shift away from the kind of economic orthodoxy that has defined, at least up until now, the last 12 years of Conservative government. So I think a few things to kind of watch out for, I suppose, over the coming weeks and months. I suppose the first thing to say is that it is a huge political gamble that I think they've taken this morning. We saw, I suppose, building on Jacob Rees-Mogg's announcement on fracking on Wednesday, we saw a few signs today, those of you who watched the statement, of MPs gently questioning some of the strategy. So we had John Glenn, Mel Stride, Kevin Hollenrake, those MPs who supported Rishi Sunak, starting to kind of not to disagree and to shoot down the statement, but to question some of the thinking and the strategy behind it. A little bit on how the opposition have responded. I mean, in a way, the opposition will probably see this as somewhat as a gift. Labour, in their response, I quote, "Let's call out trickle-down economics for what it is, the Conservatives doling out handouts to the super rich while ordinary people struggle. It didn't work in the past and it won't work now." That was Ed Miliband this morning. But I think the kind of question for the opposition would be, and Luke Trill from More in Common put this very astutely on Twitter earlier, is that the public, the electorate, don't really look at individual policies. They look at the big narrative, and they look at will they be better off? And of course, there are some big tax cuts in there that really do help people and will make a difference to people over the years ahead. But how will those fiscally conservative MPs respond? I think that's one that we should watch out for. The Treasury, in the depths of the document, have put an additional £70 billion hole in the government finances on the books. That's not insignificant. I think lots of Conservative MPs will be kind of watching out and pushing on that. On some of the hopeful stuff, as you say, I think net zero and climate largely remained intact. I think that's largely because of the economics. I guess the decision around onshore wind, a long kind of rallying call and cry from the environmental movement, saw a big win today. It saw a big win, however, in the context of a deregulatory push, as Sarah said, that, you know, in the words of some who I've spoken to this morning, is akin to declaring war on the nature and conservation movement. So I think we've really kind of watch out for that. But clearly, again, the decision to fill the cabinet with allies means that there are some really big hitters and some really important MPs. You know, not least Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, and others who could and can, if they want to, make a fuss on the backbenchers. So I think there's what do the fiscally conservative MPs do? What do environmentally minded MPs do? And finally, what story do Labour and the opposition choose to tell? You know, Kwasi stood at the dispatch box today and said, for far too long in this country, we've indulged a fight over redistribution. So Labour have a choice. Do they take on that fight? Do they take that challenge? or do they meet the Conservatives on the ground on which they're fighting at the grounds of growth and looking after the economy? In terms of the hope for us and the climate agenda, I think it's absolutely still the case that the only route out of this economic crisis is to build out renewables, insulate homes, and so I think that's, I suppose, where I think we need to keep doing everything we can to kind of make those arguments to all sides of the spectrum.
Thanks, Chris. And just on the opposition parties, clearly the government has shown that it's pragmatic on supporting people's bills and to an extent on the windfall tax, so that was under Rishi Sunak. Is there any sense that the Labour or the Liberal Democrats get the anxiety about nature and are willing to start campaigning on that as the sort of, they're saying a lot about net zero. I don't hear a lot about nature and farming, but perhaps you do.
No, I think that's right. I think obviously we've got Labour Party conference starting on Sunday. I expect we will hear a lot around energy, a lot around the climate agenda, but very little on the nature agenda, and I think that's obviously disappointing. On the Liberal Democrats, I suspect they will start to see the political opportunity in issues like sewage and water quality, and I think that's where that really intersects with what we've seen or started to see set out in the document today released, this kind of hard push around deregulation that builds on the publication or the kind of the beginnings of and those really serious questions around EU law and how we keep those really important parts of it. I suppose the kind of interesting question as well in that is farming and agriculture. Again, we've seen in the document today and mentioned briefly by the Chancellor at Dispatch Box, a push to kind of increase food production. We've seen the Lib Dems and Labour over the last 6 to 12 months flirt a little with that agenda, but again, I think that's a mistake, and I think as we kind of get closer to an election, and crucially, I suppose, and I should have said this earlier, what the polls do over the next couple of weeks. We've seen Trust have a small bounce in the polls over the last week or so. Does this event shift that significantly? If it doesn't, that has a huge impact upon, the willingness of the Conservative backbench to step up. But I think the same is true for Labour and the Lib Dems. If we're not famously a country that doesn't want to be in nature and and enjoy the natural world. So I think that is an issue. It will be an issue. It doesn't seem to be featuring in the debate in the same way that I think reflects where the public are and obviously the issue itself.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, certainly on water, there's a tension between campaigning against or opposing farming reform and opposing strong regulation of farming, and then saying you want cleaner water. That doesn't add up. But Sam.
Yeah, I think the other really interesting thing about the Lib Dems in the run-up to the election is the last iteration of this Conservative government also tried to liberalise planning rules to get infrastructure built. And when they lost Cheshire and Amersham, they took that as a sign that liberalising planning was bad policy and almost did a complete about-face. Now, Kwasi today has announced some serious proposals to accelerate nationally strategic important infrastructure. And whether that comes off will, I think, be down to how the Lib Dems and the Greens, particularly in any by-elections before the next election or in local elections, choose to oppose themselves against certain kinds of infrastructure or any form of building, full stop.
Yes, thank you. I'm on at least my 5th major planning reform since I joined CPRE in 1994, and it's not that planning reform isn't needed, but it always ends in tears unless you try really hard to get consent for it, is my experience. I wonder if anybody at the panel wants to have a stab at the question a lot of people have been asking about: has the government been so resistant to talking about demand management? We've seen the steps that have been taken in EU countries and across the world, really, to try and get people to think about their energy usage and cut it down. Ros?
I mean, it's a much asked question. I think there's a political aspect to this. We've had several schemes that haven't worked. I think that's undermined confidence a bit. There's a bit of a question as to why people wouldn't invest in this anyway. They're able to pay, but I think the kind of payback periods and the hassle factor and things, we know there's a lot of barriers. It's often sold the wrong way in the UK as well, and we kind of sell on payback period, which for some measures is better than for others, rather than thinking about kind of the additional benefits like growth, warmth and for the economy as well, kind of a breadth of jobs across a number of areas. It's also just, unfortunately, not very, it's not the most shiny thing to introduce as a government. You don't have a kind of concentration of new jobs in a single area you can point to and a big shiny new factory. Although there is some opportunity there to think actually about how we do really modernise the process of retrofitting homes, and there are some really exciting innovations using kind of factory built components and modern kind of robotized forgotten the word. Anyway, you can use drones and things to measure buildings, and there's a lot more innovation and kind of technological solutions that could be adopted in the space. And we did see a very small amount of money at one point go to kind of deep decarbonisation efforts along those lines, but it hasn't been repeated. And I think that's another place where the government should be looking to see if it can stimulate those sort of really big, really new leaps in this area. But yeah, I think it's it is overlooked, and it's just it's seen as boring, I think, sometimes.
I mean, there's also a whole lot of advice about how you can use less energy yourself. There's countries that have introduced free bus travel or reduced rail travel. I mean, it doesn't seem to be something that's on the agenda, which is
no. I think the other concern is that among politicians that they might look patronising on that front. But you could, I mean, turning down your boiler flow temperature, for instance, isn't something that I think looks particularly patronising to people. It's not quite like telling them to put on a jumper when it gets cold, and really could make a huge difference if done across the country. So there's definitely advice they could offer, and it is disappointing on that front. We are now capping bus fares at £2 per trip for January to March. So it'd be really interesting to see what happens on that front. That would be a useful measure, and that's very welcome.
Great, thanks, Ros. Chris, and then I might come to Sophie to go through the Q&A. We've got a few questions there. Chris.
Yeah, I mean, echo everything that Ros said, but also just want to say sometimes, and I'm guilty of this on an almost hourly basis, we give we sometimes think it's more complicated than it is. I think to some extent the government has been reacting on a kind of day-to-day, week-to-week basis to this crisis, and you know, you see this in some of the narratives around the North Sea where there's a lack of understanding that, and the same with fracking, that unlocking UK gas reserves will improve the situation. I think it's kind of also the case that there is just a lack of understanding that this stuff could and would make a difference. And I think that kind of puts it on us to, I think sometimes we get bored of saying the same thing, but I think we do need to keep saying the same thing and finding inventive ways to make it heard. I've certainly had conversations with people close to people making decisions where there's a serious lack of understanding around the role of demand management, the centrality of it to tackling this crisis and supporting people through a difficult couple of winters. So I think some of it as well is just making sure that people in positions of power, I suppose, particularly in a new government, are getting the right information, are getting the right briefings, and have the facts and the policy that they need to actually deliver the changes that could help.
Great, thanks. Sophie, do you want to pull out any of the questions we've had?
Yeah, we'll stick to politics for now. There's one on, the rumours are that this looks like a pre-election budget. is there a snap general election on the cards? And if so, how will it affect the Green movement?
Thanks, Sophie. Looks like one for you, Chris.
Explicitly avoided talking about an election in my in my comments. So, but here goes. I think that's right. I think, you know, the government today, as I said, has made a pitch, not just a set of small fiscal announcements, but a pitch for its vision, and it'll be watching closely and listening through the polls and focus groups to how that has landed over the next few weeks, particularly how Labour respond, particularly how you know, Liz Truss's speech at Conservative Party conference goes in 2 weeks' time. And I suspect on the back of that, I mean, any government is always considering how to stay in power, so yeah, I'd say it looks more likely than it did at 9 AM this morning that there could be an election, but clearly what they've also done today is fulfill largely a lot of what they talked about during the leadership race. And you know, I think many people said, well, it was just a leadership race and everyone says everything. They said they were going to cut taxes in a significant way as the first thing that they did when they entered government, and that is what they've done. They also said there wouldn't be an election until the end of, you know, the kind of normal end of this parliament. So let's see if there was an election and what it means for us. I suppose it's where everyone on the panel's picked up that there are certain issues that are publicly and politically very salient, in particular the issue of the energy crisis and how it's solved, in particular issues like sewage, rivers, water quality. How do we make sure that we are harnessing the kind of passion for protecting the natural world, and showing that passion and showing politicians into any election that those issues ultimately do make a difference in the ballot box.
Thanks, Chris. I'd summarise that as saying Green Alliance is confident there won't be an election for at least another year. Sophie.
Yeah, coming back to the policy now, one on onshore wind. How significant is the unblocking of onshore wind in England, and what more does the government need to do on renewables?
Who wants to go at that? Ros.
I mean, I can have a go. I think it's very valuable. Onshore wind is one of the cheapest forms of renewables, so really, really important. And we know it's been kind of stuck in the backlog planning wise. There are other issues about getting connections, for instance, for renewables, and so there's definitely other mechanisms that need to be improved as well. And although there's the commitment, for instance, on infrastructure to fast track the national policy statements for energy, that those kind of other wider planning pieces around energy need to keep moving at speed if we have any chance of meeting what are quite bold targets around renewables deployment and decarbonising the grid. The energy bill has quite a lot of kind of boring but important things like enabling a future systems operator, which can kind of take a long-term view of decarbonising the grid, as well as keeping it kind of running in the shorter term. That would need to go through as well. And there's quite a lot of suggestion that something's missing from there along those lines as well, which is giving Ofgem an explicit power around net zero. Not so much about renewables, but also I think we should also think about the responsive power needed as well alongside that. So a rapid kind of reform of the capacity market so that it's able to provide low carbon solutions that can come online and incentivise that when renewables aren't in use as well. All of those kind of things would be really useful.
Ros, are we still expecting an energy bill?
Your guess is as good as mine. I think from what I understand, yes. It's just that it is being reviewed and maybe a little longer. But Chris might have the latest on that one.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, in the document today and in this week, you know, quite a clear steer that from the 11th of October, when Parliament returns, that there will be emergency legislation to enact various of the measures. So I think the question, certainly in the briefing that was leaked from Bayes a couple of weeks ago, the insinuation seemed to be that if there were urgent parts of the energy bill, they could be considered and perhaps included in that. So there will be legislative opportunities to do things over the autumn.
Can I just ask on onshore wind, was onshore wind sort of green lighted because this is a way to bring down bills and meet our net zero commitments, or because we don't like planning?
I think it's really hard to tell. It is in the plan for growth. It is an integral part of the planning section, in that we are liberalising planning for all strategically important infrastructure, particularly those pieces of infrastructure that are going to help us reduce energy bills. But I think actually a big part of it is that public opinion, time after time after time after time again, shows that people really want onshore wind in their local area and are very supportive of it, particularly because they know it drives down lower bills. So actually you can say it's for both. It will drive down lower bills, and that is part of the justification for doing it, but it's mostly because the public are saying we really, really want this.
We could debate that one, but we won't. Sophie, any more questions?
Yeah, there's a few for Sarah now. So pivoting a bit, what outcomes do you expect for the environment from the EU law revocation bill? And also you referenced the DEFRA cuts. How big are these and what are the implications?
Sure. Well, on the second one is that we don't know yet how big they're going to be, but they sound pretty substantial. So this was the drive that obviously Jacob Rees-Mogg began when he was Minister for Government Efficiency, and we were talking departments having to think about 20, 30, 40% of staff reduction. So we don't quite know what the outcome of that will be, but that's the sort of envelope that we're working with, or civil service is working with. And then on sort of the outcome for the environment, I mean, the review of retained EU law isn't necessarily bad for the environment. If it was sort of slowed down at a sensible pace, transparent, then actually we could get some good outcomes. I mean, we're certainly not saying that things cannot be done better, but obviously changes need to be considered properly. You need consultation with stakeholders. These things need to be properly scrutinized. But so the problem is the bill brings in a process that is like unbelievably fast. So I think it's unfortunately going to be impossible to do a good job for the environment, even if you sort of wanted to, because of the rush and the lack of transparency and uncertainty.
Thanks, Sarah. Sophie, perhaps one or two more, and I'm going to wrap up the meeting. Sophie.
Yeah, kind of a broad one. What kind of policies would be good for climate and growth? And then there's also a question around kind of skills. So supply chain constraints for ramping up retrofit. Are there any sign of retrofit skills policies coming through from this government?
I can take that first one. So, I mean, there's two ways of thinking about the overlap between climate and growth. There are a series of policies that it can work across the economy that can boost growth, and that's in skills, in the delivery of infrastructure, and in the rollout of innovation. So prioritising those, we've seen government go big on infrastructure today, but making sure that infrastructure is the sort of building we're going to want in a net zero economy, not relying on existing outdated technologies. And then you can look vertically, in each sector and say, actually, how do we improve the productivity of this sector? So Green Alliance did a report recently on called Climate for Growth, which is looking very much at this and the relationship between net zero actions and productivity. So when it comes to electric vehicles, when it comes to energy installation, renewable energy, we know just getting that stuff going faster is going to be a massive boost to productivity, because they are delivering a cheaper good, i.e. electricity or outcomes at a lower price. For some of the other areas, whether we're talking hard to abate, in things like steel or aviation, we really, really need to double down on innovation and start thinking about how to tackle those thorny issues to ensure that those sectors, as strategically important industries and big employers, are also decarbonising alongside delivering jobs and growth.
Thanks, Sam. Anybody else want to go at those? If not, Sophie, any other burning questions? If there aren't, I'll bring the meeting to a close with the last question to the panelists.
We've got one on what do they mean in terms of the most vulnerable businesses when we're talking about, I assume this is to do with the energy bills cut. So when they talk about the most vulnerable businesses, what do they mean? Would they be care homes or heavy industries?
Yeah, I can pick that one up. They have set out the kind of terms of the review very briefly, and they've said that it will be those who are least able to adjust, for instance, by reducing energy efficiency or cutting the amount of electricity they use at any particular time. So, I mean, care homes could fall into that category. I imagine if they've kind of got certain sort of expectations to keep heating and lights and things running, that would certainly make sense. There are certain industrial processes as well that can't be stopped. And notably in the advice to businesses as well, government also said that, but as I mentioned, they put a business on warning. They put particularly large companies using small amounts of energy, kind of big companies that aren't energy intensive industries on particular warning. So I think you could assume that maybe they mean people like supermarkets, etc. on that front.
Great, thank you, and thanks, Sophie. Thanks to everybody who's asked the question. I'm going to end with kind of one sentence answers from everybody, starting with Chris, which is what at the moment makes you most hopeful and what makes you most concerned.
Thanks, Sean. What makes me hopeful? Onshore wind, good stuff. I think we can do something with that, and it's part of the solution to the crisis. What makes me concerned is hopefully not stealing Sarah's line here, a worrying and potentially extremely dangerous disregard for the role of regulation in protecting nature and the natural world.
Thanks, Ros.
I mean, it's hard not to say the same kind of thing, but I think the focus on energy prices and the recognition that at least renewables could be helpful, if not energy efficiency, and dealing with that, and perhaps the beginning of energy efficiency action or expanded energy efficiency action is encouraging. I feel very worried about not just the impact on nature actually as well, but also the human health impacts of unpicking EU legislation or EU retained law, which is a UK law, right? In areas like air pollution as well. It's the boring stuff, boring but important things that protect your health and keep the air clean and the food you eat clean and mean that you're buying products which don't contain toxic chemicals. So I'm quite worried from that angle as well.
Thanks, Sarah. You can't repeat that. Well, you can repeat it.
Well, as I say, yes, the hustle towards a sort of deregulatory free-for-all is probably the main concern. But the positive is that actually there's support for our current standards and actually improving them is really high. Got some great polling. The work that Unchecked does in this space is fabulous. And also lots of businesses understand that a healthy environment is an absolute bedrock for a healthy economy. And you saw the recent Aldersgate Group manifesto published yesterday saying exactly that. So we've got some good allies.
It's good, thank you. Sam.
So reasonably hopeful. Investment zones have not been proven to work in the past, so we're going to have to think about how to do them differently to make sure that they work this time. And green investment zones could be a really interesting way to go, particularly working with Ben Houchen in Tees Valley, for example. I am really worried about the amount of money government is spending on things that I don't think are necessarily a public priority, and that could well constrain our ability to do the things that are as interest rates rise and as the economy gets worse.
Thank you. Thanks very much to all our panelists. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. I think it's good to end on a few hopeful notes, but it's undoubtedly the case that we do have a kind of major reset of the government, and that we will have our work cut out with the very strong deregulatory push and the kind of not quite disappearance, but much less evidence of a strong push to net zero, nature's recovery, a green Brexit, and so on. This is not the language we are hearing. So I think we will definitely be in new territory in the next 18 months. But as I said at the beginning, we essentially have had only a week of the government. So it's early days yet, and there's a lot of detail to be put on all this. There are people we can work with all is not lost, but I do feel that we are in tougher circumstances than we were than we have been actually since the Brexit referendum, certainly. But thanks everybody, thanks to the panelists, thanks to Siri for organising, Sophie for fielding the questions. Look out for other Green Alliance events. We've got a really full programme at both the Labour and Conservative conferences, and that's on our Twitter, Green Alliance's Twitter. We've got an event in person on the 11th of October. Are we taking e-waste seriously enough? Which looks like a leading question, and that details will be on our website soon. And this debate will be on our YouTube channel pretty soon. So without further ado, thanks very much indeed, and stay in touch.